Everybody, welcome to our Monday night SAM event, our discussion on the documentary Unlearning Sex. My name is Gabby Schwartz. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the Interim Assistant Director of Health Promotion and Interpersonal Violence Prevention here at UW-Oshkosh. I am delighted to have our guests with us tonight, and we will be kind of discussing the documentary Unlearning Sex. If you haven't had a chance to watch the film yet, you can still do so until Wednesday, April 28th, and there is a link and a password for that. That if I'm guessing, maybe Alicia will drop in the chat shortly, since she's usually on top of links. But for some background, Unlearning Sex is a feature documentary that follows producer Zanah Thirus' 6-month journey through sexual trauma therapy and healing. In addition to audio clips from therapy, this film features interviews from other trauma therapists, sex educators, and activists. Zanah's goal with this film is for people to learn about sexual assault, trauma, and sex education while watching someone heal in real time. So I think we'll start with just having our panelists do some introductions.
I can go first.
Do you want to go?
Yes. So, hi, my name is Zanah Thirus. I am the prevention educator at ASTOP Sexual Abuse Center in Fond du Lac. We do cover Fond du Lac, Green Lake, and Waushara counties. So we have the satellite campuses. I don't know what your official name is for them, but UW-Oshkosh Fond du Lac campus is in our service area. And I use the she, her, hers pronouns.
I can go. My name is Kim Lafka, and I am a therapist, and I'm also the clinic manager at Reach Counseling Services. We cover the areas of primarily Winnebago County, but also depending on the service, we dip into Outagamie County a little bit and into Calumet County.
Molly, do you want to go next?
Sure. My name is Molly Lancelot. I'm the community education manager with Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin, and we have health centers all over the state, including in Oshkosh, as well as Green Bay, Appleton, other parts up there. And we have an education department based out of Milwaukee, Madison, and La Crosse. But we are able to travel throughout the state to any audience that requests, either online or in person, in the future.
Awesome. And I think I saw Tracy was on here. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi. I am Tracy LaRumo, and I am the case manager at Reach Counseling in Neenah. Kim kind of already introduced our organization, and my job is to help facilitate the clients that we work with to help connect them with community resources, along with people that might just need additional help that are currently on our counseling waiting list.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, I think that is everybody. Did I miss someone who was expecting to be on the panel and is not?
Well,
Hi, Tim. Okay.
Hi, I think I am too.
Yes, you are. Your name showed up at the top because of the dashes, not. I was like looking for Tim and I didn't see it, so my apologies.
That's okay. So I'm Tim Smith. I'm a therapist at Reach Counseling, and I specialize in sex offender treatment, but also trauma therapy. And I'm gonna keep my camera off just because I have the cat in here with me, and my child might bust into the room at some point. So.
Fair enough. You may have already spotted my dog jolting through. Sometimes she gets a burst of energy in the evening, and doesn't understand that I work different hours. So I will mute myself if she gets too annoying. I just want to give a general content warning for everybody attending tonight, that our discussion will include mentions of sexual violence and experiences, as well as talking about healing. So please do what you need to do to take care of yourself. If you need to mute us or mute yourself, turn off your camera, whatever it is, know that that is allowed. You have permission to do that because we want you to focus on your well-being. So I think with that, we will just jump right in. Our first question is that the documentary focuses on therapy specific to sexual trauma. What is the benefit for a sexual assault victim survivor to seek out a therapist who specializes in sexual trauma? The second part of that is, where can a person find such a therapist, or what should they look for when searching? I think maybe it would be fine for folks to just chime in with what answer they have. I know that we need to go in a certain order.
I can speak to that as obviously one of the therapists in the room. There's a lot of benefits to seeking out somebody who specializes in dealing with sexual trauma. As I was watching the documentary, it was really clear, some of the unique problems that survivors of sexual trauma experience aren't well understood, I think, by the average person. Particularly, for example, like they really spoke quite a bit about the fact that that occasionally pleasure is, that assault survivors often experience pleasure in the course of their assault. This is one of those things that I think people just don't understand. And a therapist who specializes in sexual trauma understands these things. So therefore, it knows to, number one, ask the questions. Because this is one of those things that a client's probably not going to mention unless you ask. And also knows to be able to explain that in a way where you don't have to feel shamed about it, and it can be very normalized. Any of our, in seeking services, I start with the sexual assault service providers in the area. We have several, and they're all really great. But beyond that, don't be afraid to interview your therapist if you're going someplace. If they say they do trauma work, if you're not sure, feel free to ask for an interview, ask for a consult. You have the right to do that.
I don't know if there are any other things that folks want to add. I think to go off of what Kim said about not being afraid to interview your therapist, I think it's also okay to know that maybe the first one's not going to work, and it's okay if they don't. And it's okay to switch therapists, which can be frustrating. I can acknowledge that, right? No one wants to have to explain things over and over, but finding the right person is really important.
That's very true, and we talk to our clients about that when they show up a lot. That it doesn't happen often, but occasionally we'll realize as we're starting with somebody that the fit isn't quite right, and in that case we'll facilitate a switch to a different therapist at the agency to see if that's a better fit for a client. And any therapist who's a good therapist will not be upset if you say that to them. If they get upset, they're probably not the right person for you anyway.
I don't know if anybody wants to maybe elaborate a little bit on maybe what a victim survivor might look for when searching for a therapist. I think when we look on psychology today, it's very overwhelming, or when you're looking at an agency's page, right, and they just list all of their therapists, it can be overwhelming. And for those who maybe don't have a background in counseling or social work or psychology, it's hard to understand terms or experiences of therapists to see if that's the right fit for what you're looking for.
Say, like I said, I don't want to keep answering, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure that there's anybody. I'm not sure. I'm probably the therapist here with, I've been with Reach for almost 14 years, I think, going on. And I say that I think sometimes it's okay to look for experience. I remember an intake that I saw recently in our on our wait list, and she was very clear about she was looking for somebody, that she was looking for somebody who had, who was an experienced therapist. And when and later on when I heard her story, there was a good reason for that she'd had some some bad experiences. But I've also often been interviewed quite heavily by new clients. How long have you been here? What do you think about, people who've asked me some actually very difficult questions, people who ask me, like, what do you do? I've even had people ask me, what do I do to take care of myself? Because they want to make sure that can be a good model for self-care for them. I get asked about my approach to treatment. How do I envision recovery? But say there are a few. I think most of our therapists are actually we have some additional certification as certified. We're certified clinical trauma professionals. So I mean, you might check and see if they have any additional certifications, which means that they've at least gone to the trouble of getting some extra training beyond just their counselor training. So that might be worth, and if we, like on our website, if you look on our website, most of our therapists have a whole lot of extra letters after their names, which if they're not described, you're welcome to call and say, what does that mean? But that might give you a hint as to what they've at least bothered to get some extra training in.
I think too, with trauma specifically, a therapist or counselor that's certified with EMDR can be really helpful. For people who are familiar, or for people who are looking for that. I am not great at explaining it, as I am not a therapist myself, but EMDR can be very, very effective for trauma. So when we'll go and speak about our services and mention, oh yes, our counselors are EMDR, they've done the training, that kind of thing, people who recognize and who know who that is, or know what that is, their eyes light up, and you can tell they're like, oh, that's good, because they've heard how great it can be for trauma, or they've experienced a few sessions with it and they know that it can be really helpful. Not always for everyone, just like we mentioned with the different therapists, maybe not always being a fit, but can be really helpful. So another one would be EMDR.
Awesome. So our next question is that folks might be familiar with the fight or flight response. I feel like we talk about that a lot. We've even sort of started to talk a bit more about the freeze response, but the documentary also talks about the appease response. Could you share a little bit about what it means to fight, flight, freeze, or appease?
I love that they talked about this in the documentary. And we're learning so much more about the brain. There's also some really great emerging research on the defense, on defenses. There, like you said, there's fight or flight. People people forget about freeze, but then we're learning more about, like you said, there's a that you might call it. I've seen it called please and appease. I've seen it called fawn. But also beyond that, and again, like I said, this is really emerging, so it's kind of hard to find really good info on yet at this point without paying a lot of money. So But they also talk about there's like collapse. I think collapse. There's some collapse, submerge, or something like that. But there's a lot of trauma responses that I think are important to understand about, because they can really help a person to understand why and how they responded in a certain way during an event or a number or ongoing events. And again, this is another reason why it's really good to have somebody who's got experience treating trauma. Because these are the people who will not question, so why didn't you fight? Or why didn't you run away? These are the people who will be able to kind of talk about, how did you respond? Well, I froze, or, well, I decided to go along with it and kind of, try to make them happy. That instead of any shame, it's just like, tell me more about that and tell me why you did that, because there's a good reason for that. And it might be the reason that you survived the event. That you did it for a reason, and a good trauma therapist will never make you feel ashamed for however you responded during an event.
If I could jump in, just not as a therapist, but as a sex educator, and I've also spent over a decade as a sexual assault advocate in a local ER. I think the important part of that, and I really liked the clip that they showed with Gillian Anderson. I'm not sure what show that was from, but that the appease or please is the survival, and the the lessening violence when you go along with it to make it through it. If you were fighting back, then you may get stabbed or beaten up or strangled. And if you are just going along with it and letting it happen, that is a way to survive. And I think that that's a really important thing. And if you are here watching as, a friend who may know someone who's been assaulted, those kinds of questions of why didn't you run away or why didn't you yell are really victim blaming and can be really harmful. And just surviving however a person can is what they have to do in the moment. And we can't know how we would react unless we were in that situation.
Mm-hmm.
I like what you said a lot, Molly. Oh, sorry.
I'm just wondering, are the other panelists able to talk? Because there's only like 3 of us here. Where are they?
I think there's only 4 panelists total today anyways.
Oh, okay. Well, then I guess Tim is being quiet.
Well, here's the thing.
But
like, I was gonna answer some of these questions too, but like Kim answers them so well that it's just like, I mean, she's been there a lot longer than I have, and a lot of the stuff that I know, I learned from her. So really, when it comes down to it, I mean, she has the better answers. So it's not that I'm not paying attention or I'm just being quiet. It's just more, I don't know if I could really add more to what Kim said.
I think it looked like maybe Tracy or Rihanna was going to add something. I don't know for sure, but I wanted to leave space if there was something that somebody wanted to add.
Kim did an excellent job, like Tim said, and so I didn't necessarily have anything that I was going to say that was going to be any different. The flight, fight, or freeze kind of component that she already covered. Personally, I feel like the freeze is something we don't often talk about enough. We just hear flight or fight. And so I feel it's really good to kind of acknowledge that sometimes we just don't do anything. And I think we've all been in that position without realizing it, that we can't do either of it. So we can't run away, but we can't fight it either. So I wanted to make sure I pointed that out, but I think Kim covered.
Mm-hmm. And I appreciated the comment about, like, I think that this is such an important thing for, if you happen to be, the friend or a loved one of somebody who's experienced an assault. These are important things to know, because I think it's so easy to, very out of ignorance or just lack of knowledge, to say something that does come across as victim blaming, and unfortunately how easily that can shut a person down. So I think so I appreciated that comment about, like, if you're a friend or loved one, this is good information to have.
And I know it was already said, but I just want to reiterate for any survivors that are watching or listening, that whatever gets you out of the situation, surviving that situation, is the right decision. There's not a wrong, I should have done this, I should have done that. Whatever allows you to survive is the right decision. And really nobody should question that, including therapists and your advocates. Hopefully they will be the ones that for sure will not question that. How do you all think that understanding the freeze and the appease responses helps us to understand experiences of sexual victimization?
I think you summed it up well, Gabby, by saying, it's different, and whatever you did to survive that situation was the right thing. And I think something else to remember is, unfortunately, some individuals may experience more than one assault, and each one of those instances could be different. There may have been a time where you fought, and that's fine. And there may have been a time where you froze, and that's fine. There's so many different dynamics that go into it, whether it's, that person had, a weapon, or the threats, or just the intimidation, or it was a partner, and, all the different aspects that go into that each individual is going to be different, and each individual assault is going to be different.
And I think it's also good to know that these are deeply, deeply ingrained survival responses. These are the responses. These responses exist in the animal world. They exist everywhere. These are things that, like, I hear people talk about, say things like, oh, if it ever happened to me, I'd kick his butt, I'd run away. And I always think, I'm like, I don't know. I'm like, I've been doing this for years, and I have no idea how I'd respond. That I've met people who in general in their lives are, oh my gosh, they're fighters. But when it came to, the being assaulted, again, like you said, there's, like Rihanna said, that your brain can very quickly assess the situation in terms of safety. That's your amygdala jumping in and helping you out. Is that it jumps in and it goes, oh, gun, oh, there's no escape, oh my gosh, he's really big, or oh my gosh, there's many people. How do I, and it will do and your brain will prompt you to do what is most likely to get you out of it with the least amount of damage possible. And I think it's important to understand that these are, like, this is brain stuff. There's a ridiculous amount of research on this. These aren't even, in some cases, I don't even know how conscious these choices are in these moments. Our brain, our amygdala knows how to take care of us.
I have a thought about that that conversation that goes on amongst people who maybe haven't experienced sexual trauma, who have those beliefs that they would do this or that, or they wouldn't allow for someone to assault them. And in my training as an advocate, we learned that is really a self-soothing promise in belief that you have some control over a person who is going to assault you. And it's a fallacy, but it's something that people tell themselves because it is so scary to think of being assaulted or being raped. And so while it's not meant to be harmful or judging, it is meant to reassure yourself that you would have some control. But just as you said, it's so deep in our reptile brains that it's done without conscious thought, and none of us know what we would do in those situations, and it could be different from situation to situation with the same person's reaction. So just something to think about if you're ever questioning someone's behavior and that you wouldn't have done it that way. You wouldn't necessarily have the control you think you would in those situations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was gonna kind of chime in on this too, and I have a client not too long ago that I was working with that was actually mad at themselves because they were date raped. And they were upset because they couldn't fight back because that power was taken away from them. And they really blamed themselves because, you know, I mean, they were victim blaming themselves of, well, I should have watched my drink, I should have did this, I should have did that. And it just took a little bit for me to help this client to understand that, you know, what happened was not your fault, and that was just the circumstances, and nobody goes to a bar expecting that, hey, I need to always make sure I'm watching my drink because someone might put something in it. You know, this person was out having a good time and wasn't doing anything wrong, and someone put something in this person's drink, and the next thing this person knows, they wake up the next day and, you know, they're at someone's house and don't remember how they got there, what happened, none of that. So yeah, I mean, I think I'm not really sure exactly where I was going with that. I think more it was just that that I think people blame themselves even when there's no control over the situation, if that makes sense. You know, whether, you know, that people talk about, well, like Kim was saying, well, I would kick their butt or I would do this or do that. Well, you don't really know what you're going to do in the situation, or that option might not even be there because, you know, something else might happen to you, like being drugged.
So as professionals in the field who have now watched this documentary, what kind of stood out to you about the experiences of sexual assault victim survivors and the healing process?
I can share my favorite part about it. I think that the coolest thing, and like, which I have not dove into documentaries quite like this before. I try to sometimes separate the work and home life, but sometimes I get sucked into sexual violence documentaries because I can't help it. But I thought it was really cool about how the therapist focused so much on her like reclaiming her body and like learning to love herself again and like that sort of thing, because I think that's such a tricky situation for survivors, and like there's so many different elements that go into it. But she was saying, you know, how like she went and bought a vibrator and she's like, I've never done this, and I'm like, this is so exciting. Like that was awesome to see that was a tactic, I guess, like a guided kind of homework there. And I thought that was really awesome because I'd not seen obviously any information about a ton of information about like sexual trauma therapy before. So I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, I want to build off of that because I say that the fact that this therapist was comfortable enough to really focus on her like directly reclaiming her sexual, you know, her sexuality, her body, was amazing. And I was just thinking, you know, that back at the beginning we were talking about what do you look for, you know, when you're looking for a therapist. And honestly, one of the things I think that you really need to look for is somebody who does not flinch about talking about the sex stuff. You know, who just puts it out there like it's a thing. It's not, there's no weirdness. There's no giggling. There's no it's just the sex is a thing. And I really appreciate it, you know, and as I was watching that part, I mean, there were so many things I thought about, because there are things I talk about frequently with clients is, you know, like, you know, that men are kind of like taught and whatever that, like, you know, masturbation, like it's expected, guys do this. Nobody ever talks to girls about it. And I really think that's a shame. And I think there's regardless of whether you've been a survivor or not, how in the world are you going to tell a partner what you like or don't like if you haven't tried it out? Because again, here's another, it's another biology issue. The female orgasm is a complex thing. It doesn't work. Not every woman achieves orgasm in the same way. And I think, there should be no shame in a woman finding out how she achieves orgasm. So I really think that's a very cool thing to do. And I was really appreciative of that. But one of the other side notes, and again, kind of like this idea that, that sometimes pleasure is a part of the equation when somebody's being assaulted is very important. But one of the things that I see a lot is that I've met a lot of women who get, who have some, they find somebody nice and they have a good sexual experience. Perhaps they even have an orgasm. And that, and most people would go, oh my gosh, that's wonderful. We should celebrate that. But what happens so often is that those people then come back into session and go, but then I spent a half an hour crying in the bathroom afterwards. Because it's very scary. And I think that you say, I've had some women who have been terrified about orgasm because there's an element of losing control when you have an orgasm. And I have one client in particular, as and again, I think this is probably maybe a little more common than I want to think it is. Her abuser was a very sadistic person, didn't want her to enjoy it. But again, sometimes, you push the right buttons and an orgasm happens. And she had that happen once. And he was furious and punished her terribly for it. So now the idea of having an orgasm is terrifying, there's a lot of reasons. So, I mean, just because it felt good doesn't mean you've won the game. And I think that's these are important things to be able to talk about with your therapist. And you need to have a therapist who isn't going to get weird about it.
I think I want to jump in on that and just spend a little time on one piece for those who haven't maybe watched the documentary yet. That I think this idea that pleasure or orgasm can be part of sexual violence can be kind of complex, especially when we say that. And so I just want to articulate that even if orgasm happens, that doesn't mean it was okay. That doesn't mean that it was enjoyable. I think a really great example that they gave in the documentary, which just made a lot of sense to me, even though that was something I heard and I knew, it just really clicked, was a person talking about how their vagina, they didn't expect to be so wet in that moment. And that it was no, this is your body saying, something's going to happen and you need lubricant, right? So that doesn't mean that it was okay, but it was a protective factor of the body. I don't know if anybody has anything else to add, but I wanted to dive into that for a minute.
What I often say, one of the examples that I often give my clients when I'm trying to explain this is that, because we all know somebody, we all are we're either ticklish or we know somebody who's terribly ticklish. And my husband is one of those very ticklish people. And I happen to know that I know exactly I know exactly what kind of touch and what kind of places will get him, he'll shake and he'll giggle. But the reality is, so it looks like he's enjoying it. But the reality is, anybody who's ticklish knows this is not fun. It really doesn't feel good. But there's something, it's just a thing that happens. You touch the right spot in the right way, and there's a response for some people. So I touch the right spot on my husband in the right manner, and he will giggle like the Pillsbury Doughboy, and he's probably going to be mad if he hears I said that. But it doesn't mean it feels good. So, and I think that's true for the sexual response, is that sometimes a perpetrator will oftentimes even unknowingly stumble across our bodies are programmed to respond in certain ways to certain types of touches. Doesn't matter who does it. So if your abuser happens to stumble on your spots in the right way and at the right time, you may find yourself having a pleasure response, but that doesn't mean you wanted it, doesn't mean you consented to it. Doesn't mean a damn thing except he got lucky and found the right spot.
I don't know if others have things to add about that, but I just wanted to give that a little space just for those who haven't had a chance to watch the documentary and maybe we're like, what are these people talking about when they're talking about pleasure as part of sexual violence? But if others wanted to share pieces that stood out to them in the documentary.
One of the other pieces I think that stood out to me about the healing journey, I enjoyed hearing about how she wrote, she wrote the letter to her 16-year-old self, and that was very cool. But what I really enjoyed hearing about was that she was assigned to rewrite that letter towards the end of therapy, which I just thought was which I thought was really awesome, because I'm sure, like, she didn't share the letter exactly, but I'm sure that second letter was so much more kind and compassionate than the first one was, because I'm sure the first one was full of self-doubt and was it my fault? I'm sure it was my fault. And the second one was probably much different.
I think one of the things that sort of related to the question you just asked, Gabby, of people seeking healing, one of the things that I know I hear a lot is how long it takes people sometimes to go to find the therapy and the help after they've lived with an experience for sometimes decades, and not even necessarily acknowledge that it was assault and rape, because that wasn't in their definition, or they were in a relationship, or whatever reason. It takes sometimes a long time of thought and discussion before you realize what happened to me was not okay, and this wasn't just a bad relationship or an unfortunate bad instance, but it really was assault. And so the fact that it was like 10 years past multiple assaults before she went to find therapy to really help means that people live with it for a long time, and I think learn to cope and learn to squelch it down and try to manage it in relationships, which can create problems. And obviously there were feelings around her parents and how they raised her and put her into college, which much older people when she didn't have those social skills. So there's just so much that goes into it that takes a long time for people to get ready to do that hard work, because therapy is hard and uncomfortable work if you're doing it to find a solution for yourself.
And I will be honest, I'm actually I was actually pretty blown away when I realized, like once you kind of heard her backstory, that she actually sought therapy as soon as she did. Because I think she was about 16 when the first one happened. And it sounded like, I think she was 24, 25 when she sought therapy. I was actually quite impressed, because there were a lot of barriers for her to seeking treatment.
I think piece that really stood out for me, and Rihanna, I don't know if your prevention educator mind was going kind of nuts, because mine was just like spinning the whole 35 minutes, about like how the way her parents talked about sex and how they thought keeping their child naive was like the best way to protect them, but how it really left their children like in these positions to be taken advantage of, and in these super vulnerable positions because their kids just didn't know. And my assumption was also that they didn't then have a comfort level to ask their parents these questions, right? And I was just like, couldn't stop thinking about how we need comprehensive, inclusive, LGBTQ plus oriented, pleasure-based sex education across the nation. I even wrote down, I think one of the questions she asked was like, what if we taught vibrators in sex ed? And I was like, what if, like, what if instead of just showing pictures of gonorrhea, we taught vibrators? Like, maybe that would help some things. And I think we know that consent education is lacking a lot in sex education. And I just like kind of couldn't stop thinking about all these similarities to my parents and growing up in the small town that I'm from and how we approach sex ed to the documentary and her experience. And I just, yeah, that was just mind blowing for me.
I was, for lack of better terms, I was shook that she was having conversations with her mom and asking like, well, you know, what were you guys thinking when you were teaching us about that? Because I was like I was just shocked because and I'm thinking like the mom doesn't like, that's probably how she was taught to teach sex ed. So like, it's just, you know, it's the vicious cycle. And if we're not having it, but I was just like, how is she not noticing that like you messed up? But, and again, you can't blame a parent for an assault, but like you mentioned, putting them into vulnerable situations and being naive, like that sort of thing. So it's like, where do we got to fill in the gaps. So that's, you and I, I'm sure, and Molly too, I'm sure could talk for hours about comprehensive sex education. I'm sure everyone too, but hopefully everyone.
Yeah. But yeah, we really do. I've seen, and as a therapist, I see the results of what you're talking about is that, is how, that, and this is a case, and this is especially a case even of just very well-intentioned parents, but who truly did a terrible disservice to their children by not preparing them and thinking it was sufficient to say, you don't do that until you find the person you're going to marry. And I know you're young to go to college, because I think, so I think I was struck by, I think she was talking to her father about this, about like, I was 15 and I was, and I was talking, and he's like, well, why were you talking to that 25-year-old? Well, because I was in class with them. And he's like, well, but why weren't you just talking about class? Because that's like the fact that they like didn't even occur to them that that there would be this even just semi-social interaction that might happen. And then beyond that, I was thinking like, even if she totally separated herself from all those older classmates, good Lord, she's hearing them. And and I've been in rooms with college students. It is interesting. I'm sure even if she'd sat like a mouse in the corner, she would have heard some stuff that she had no idea what to make of. And she wasn't prepared for that. And that made me so sad for her. And I was just thinking about a story too, that we had a child therapist several years ago who had a family that, and I want to say one of the parents was like a nurse, because you talk about like, you have to give good sex ed, and as simple as like teach kids the right names for the body parts. And she got a lot of pushback, and I'm sure, and again, it's because they're uncomfortable. But there was this mother, this family, and apparently they would call the vagina, the female genitals, it's your pocketbook. And and our child therapist at the time, of course, was horrified and terrified for this poor child, because I think she finally got through, and she's like, okay, so like if you teach them that's the word, so your little girl goes to her teacher and says, so and so touched my pocketbook. Like any reasonable teacher, all they're going to say is, well, tell them not to, and won't understand the significance of that. And then again, and now the child is shamed because if something bad happened because I didn't tell them not to. So now how much longer is it before that child finally tells? And that just, stories like that come up, and I think about that, that a parent's discomfort with the terminology or the topic, in the way a child can inadvertently be harmed by that.
I can jump in about sex education and the misperception that teaching these topics gives teenagers ideas and that they weren't going to think of them on their own or ask their peers for answers or their siblings. If we don't bring up these things, then they're not going to even imagine them. And that we know that's completely false, and that when you do that comprehensive sex education, and especially delve into things like personal boundaries and things you want in a partner relationship and those other kinds of consent, all of that helps to allow a person to really be thoughtful about the decisions they're making sexually and generally delay their sexual onset because they've gotten enough information to realize, yeah, maybe I'm not quite ready for this, or I'm not interested in this. And the whole showing the pictures of, oozing genitalia around STIs is just known to be a terrible way to teach, because we know that most STIs have no signs or symptoms. So that's just a false sense of security and attempted scare tactic that doesn't give anyone any skills to actually be able to talk to their partner about getting tested or be able to examine their own genitals to see what looks normal and what feels normal. And so those scare tactic type sex educations definitely create more harm and then add to the shame and the guilt. And there's, I've heard said, and I have to find someone to attribute the quote to, but it's something around sex education teaches you that sex is bad and wrong and dirty, but you should save it for someone you love. And that is just such a confusing message when we hear as young adolescents and teenagers, don't do it, it's wrong, here are terrible consequences and everything's going to fall off and you're going to get pregnant and die. But when you're married, it's going to be a beautiful, wonderful thing. And you'll just know at that point. But that is obviously not the situation everyone is in. And that doesn't, again, give you any knowledge about how do you get to that good, pleasurable, loving relationship if you're just scared to death of it before then. So, yeah, definitely here endorsing of sex ed and wanting to make clear that there are no requirements to teaching sex ed in our schools in Wisconsin. It's a district by district, school by school decision, and they get to choose whatever curriculum they want, written by whomever or written by themselves, with or without, good scientific basis. So if you are a parent or a concerned student, that's something to take up as a cause, because we just have such an inconsistency in what kids get in our state if they're in a school, and certainly then there's the homeschool situation, as this documentary was illustrating.
Another thing too, from being a certified sex offender treatment provider, with sex education, I mean, I'm pretty sure all schools are still teaching abstinence, right? Abstinence only. Don't have sex until, kind of like what Molly was saying, until you're married. And the issue that I'm finding in the research that I'm doing with pornography is a lot of teenagers are turning to pornography to get their sex education, which is creating a whole nother problem within itself. So just wanted to throw that out there too.
The understanding that pornography is as accurate a portrayal of sex as NASCAR is an accurate portrayal of safe driving. It's just, it's kids see it and they say, well, that's how it's done, and they're doing it, so that must be what you need to do, but not understanding the contracts and consent and behind the scenes things that went on, and that it is acting to some degree. And so, yeah, unfortunately, you're right that a lot of that sex education through pornography leads to really unpleasurable and confused sexual relationships.
And and again, it's like Tim said, also, like, in addition to this, I think it's important for parents to know, like, parents need to know that they need to talk to their kids about this, because unfortunately, it's not a if your kid runs across porn on the internet, it's probably a when these days. I remember when I, like way back when I first started, the conversation was like, let's make sure you're ready just in case your kid comes across some porn. But like, or as the years went by, it's like, no, this is gonna happen at some point. You need to know how to handle this. And you need to be proactive about it.
Yes, and the average age right now that children are looking at pornography online is 12.
So don't wait.
I think those are really great points, talking about just like the gaps in our sex education system. I had a really fantastic professor in graduate school, Dr. Emily Rothman, who has developed like a pornography literacy series for adolescents in Boston. And it's, you know, designed to reduce occurrences of sexual and dating violence, and like having discussions with students about not necessarily like promoting pornography, but really the approach of, we know students are watching it. Like, we know that this is what students are doing. So why aren't we hosting conversations with students to talk about it and to talk about representations of sex, how consent is discussed, just those kinds of things. Because like, I think we're doing a complete disservice to all students of any age when we know that these are behaviors that they're engaging in, and we're just choosing to ignore it because we're too uncomfortable to talk about it. So the documentary includes discussions of both sexual assault and sex education, as we've mentioned. Is there anything further that anybody wants to add on kind of the connection between sexual assault prevention and sex education?
I think what Molly was saying with personal boundaries when we're talking about comprehensive sex education is it's not just about intercourse. It also includes the information about boundaries, what you're comfortable with, what you're ready for, and really consent as a whole. Like, I think that's such a big piece that's missing because, and as Tim was saying too, you know, we're talking about abstinence, but then what about when we get to the point, you know, and maybe people practice abstinence until they're married, and that's perfectly wonderful and fine, but you need to know what you're comfortable with. Hopefully we all know that sexual assault and, you know, rape can still happen in marriages, in partnerships, in relationships. So if you're not having that conversation about consent, then you're not setting people up for success. And just because you're talking about consent, and Molly, I'm so glad you said this, just because you're talking about consent does not mean that these students are going and having sex. It's like, that's not how that works. We're just trying to make sure that they're well-rounded individuals. I've had conversations about that. Just because you have a conversation about consent, we're not talking even necessarily about sex, right? Because consent can be used for all sorts of stuff. And that's many a conversation had and will continue to have.
Yeah, and I think that conversation about consent, I think we often think that's about you figuring out how to give your consent, but it's also figuring out how to ask for consent from your partner and how to communicate with your partner in a way that everybody's comfortable, and probably before clothes start coming off, but you know, having these conversations in the daylight. And this could speak to the fight, flight, or freeze response. If you are doing things with a partner and they stop responding and they go frozen, you need to recognize that and stop, because they may have, you know, just frozen because they're scared and they don't know how to verbalize it. And so seeking and giving that consent is really important on both sides, on all sides, to know how to read it, how to give it. It isn't always verbal. It's ideal to be verbal, but it isn't always. And then, you know, making sure it's enthusiastic consent and, you know, fully informed consent, and all those things that ideally, you know, respectful relationships have. And and sometimes we have to frame it that, you know, certainly you might be interested in a sexual relationship and you might be trying to get that orgasm for yourself. But I would hope that very few of the teenagers that, you know, we work with in a classroom are out seeking to hurt others. And so if you care even slightly about your partner, even if you just, you know, met them, you don't want to put them in a situation where you've assaulted them because you weren't reading those cues or you weren't paying attention and you were just trying to get your own pleasure met. And, you know, so there's some teaching of empathy that goes in there too. And, you know, that means it needs to be an 8 or 10 lesson sex ed class and not just a one time, here's the dirty STI pictures, don't do it. And now we're done. And that's complicated.
And it's a process to teach this. I'd say I was just remembering it. We had a therapist, one of the therapists we had a couple of years ago. She had a teenage son, and he was an older teenager, so I think he was. But and she joked a little bit. She's like, I think I might have actually done a little too good a job. But she talked to him so much about consent that you know, he had a girlfriend, and I think the girlfriend might have spoken to our therapist and said, he's overdoing it a little. Like, she's like, I think she finally had to tell him, like, stop. Like, at this point, you know, like, we've been together long enough. You can assume that I'm on board unless I say something, you know. But I thought it was beautiful that he was that, that she taught him to be that concerned. Because I mean, how, you know, because it's, you know, how unusual it is for you know, to have a couple where in the situation where the girlfriend is like, seriously, we're good now. We're good now. I'll just, like, don't ask for, you know, like, you don't have to check in with me unless we're going to do something new or unless I tell you. Like, otherwise you could just assume I'm good. And I thought how amazing that she that she put in the effort to teach him all of that.
Yeah, we had an event with students at the beginning of April talking about consent and, you know, boundaries, saying no. We talked about respecting the other person's no, which I think is a huge piece of consent too, right? Where we hear about, like, I said no, but then they pouted and they just stared at me across the room all night because I said no and they got grumpy, right? Like, we talked about coercion and societal perceptions. And I think at the end of the event, it was very clear that it was like, these are all conversations that would have been appropriate to have had in high school, right? And now here we are in college having them, which is, it's never too late for those conversations, but thinking about, like, all these things that could have been changed if we would have had these conversations with younger students, teaching bodily autonomy, teaching basic consent. And I loved that Rihanna added that, like, consent is not just about sex. Like, there are so many other ways that you use consent and how that plays a role in your everyday life in non-sexual ways. And so I think there just is a lot to reforming the sex education system. So if you want to join the mission, I'm sure that some of us could connect you. So another one of the discussions in the documentary centered on how parents talked about sex with their kids, which we've kind of alluded to. But what are some effective strategies that parents, or those of us who don't have kids but maybe have nieces or nephews or other young ones in our lives and maybe have influence with the parents, what are some ways that adults can talk about sex with kids, especially if it's a conversation that they might be uncomfortable with or nervous about?
One of my favorite resources that I have right now, I do have children, they're 5 and 8, possibly. I had to think about that way too long. Is sex positive parenting. And it's a great resource that they have some books and obviously a weekly, like monthly newsletter, podcast, things like that talk about sex positively, kind of like you all have been alluding to this evening, is rather than just talking about abstinence, to be able to talk about it in a positive way. So it isn't just all the negative stuff, so that we can better prepare them to be in those safe places. So that's been one of my favorite resources that I found as a parent, but that I also bring to my work as well, just because I do believe that it offers some great insights for how to do that in the right way.
And to add on to that, they have a lovely, lovely Instagram account, which if you're on Instagram, I highly encourage you. I highly recommend it. Because it's a great introduction, and there's just some wonderful posts that are just so enlightening.
One thing that I tell if I'm interacting with clients or on the rare occasion, or interacting with people out in the community, parent groups, that sort of thing, is, and we've kind of alluded to this, is it doesn't have to be like a one and done. It shouldn't be a one and done. It's an ongoing small step thing. And I think what's important too, and I love that you guys mentioned the podcast, is you can use pop culture, you can use TV shows, you can use social media. And let's say you see a situation in one of like the TV shows that you watch where maybe someone didn't get consent. That's the time where you can say, oh, like, how would you feel about that? Or like, what could you do differently in that situation? And again, I don't have kids. I don't even have any pets. Like, I might be the worst person to ask, but I think it's important to take it step by step, and don't be afraid to answer your kids' questions, and make sure you have those open relationships. Like we saw in the documentary, that didn't appear that those conversations, first of all, were being had to the extent that they should have been had. And like you said earlier on, Gabby, that there wasn't that reciprocation of like, you can ask a question, and even if it makes you feel uncomfortable, like we'll still talk about it. And so I guess one piece of advice for parents is to, as uncomfortable as it might make you, make sure you're answering your kids' questions. And if you don't know the answer, it's okay, but get a reputable source and then answer it. Because you don't want to tell them, well, I don't know, or it doesn't matter, or feed them wrong information, because you don't tell them anything, they're going to get it from their peers. And then is that the correct or reputable or accurate information? Probably not. So it's hard. I'm sure it's hard. I don't know, but it's step by step.
And just a small thing, I was also just thinking about, sometimes there are certain words and terms that are just like I don't think much about it, but like they're hard to say. They feel awkward depending on whatever, maybe we have baggage around them, or, we're just, or we're, society doesn't make them okay to say. And quite a few years ago now, like I remember I was doing my trauma-focused CBT training, and our trainers were, because not everybody there was like, they weren't necessarily trauma therapists to begin with. And they were talking about the importance of like, you have to be able to say these words. And I throw this out there just because, like, if you're out there as a parent and you're listening, and the idea of teaching your children to say, penis, vagina, vulva, all those nice words instead of your privates, if those are hard words for you, go in a room all by yourself and just say them over and over and over until it's not weird. Go stand in a room all by yourself and just go vagina, vagina, vagina until it's not weird. And then dive in. And and I remember when we came, I think it was it was a couple days, I think it was one of the follow-ups for that. There were a number of the people at that training who said they had gone home and done that. Because this was not natural for them. It was not normal for them. So they, what are the words that are hard for you to say? And they just went home and they took care of it.
I think another point of reassurance for parents is that just because your kids are asking something does not mean they're doing it, does not mean someone's trying to get them to do it. They may have overheard someone say something or heard a joke or something on TV, and they're just trying to understand what things are. And so it may be our reaction as adults to be like, who said that to you? What are they trying to, and being very concerned about that victimness. But sometimes just asking the kid, well, what do you think it means? Or tell me more about why you're asking this, can help you get at really what the root of questions are if they're asking them, and not that that they're in danger. But you can certainly reiterate that it's safe to come and talk to you and to get help if they need it. But I think we do need to do better in supporting parents in these conversations. And that is also with sex education, when done well and right, the acknowledgement that your parents and your families are the most important sex educators you have in your life. And you should go back to them for finding out what your family values are and what your religious beliefs are. All of those things are not things that can be dictated by a teacher. But if your family says nothing, if your parents say nothing and they want you to be quiet and not ask those questions, then that is a communication about the topic of sex. And it is that there's something wrong with it, you shouldn't ask, and that might make it harder for them to get the support of trusted adults when they need it.
Mm-hmm. I often think about, I often think about my mother, because I'm 50 years old, so that my mother must have been so far ahead of herself. But I remember being, I think it was 9 or 10, and I think I'd seen something on TV. But I went to my mother and I said, how do people have sex? Because when you see it on just kind of like whatever TV, it's just like you see kind of two bodies pressed together. But the question was, what was happening in between there? And I think back, and I've told my mom how much I appreciate this. I do remember the super deep breath first, the holy shit, I can't believe I have to answer this breath. But that she knew what I needed and what I was asking, and she didn't go into all that, well, when a mommy and a daddy love each other very much stuff, because that was kind of how people talked about it back then. She just looked at me and she took that deep breath and she said, the penis goes in the vagina. And being 9 or 10, all of my answer was ew, and that was it. But being such an askable parent, because that was fine, but because that was the kind of parent my mom was, when it came time to ask something important, like, Mom, I need you to help me get on birth control, I could ask her. And again, the deep breath, I'm not happy about this, but yes, I will help you. I'm forever grateful for that mother. She's probably the reason she is probably the only reason I was not a teen mother.
I think, Kim, you hit on an important piece of how we're responding to kids or students' questions, and ensuring that it's not in a shame-based way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because that leaves the space open for further questions. And I think about I've done a little bit of research into sexual development in kids, and also have a few young nephews, and just talking with my friend, and she's like, well, the boys are discovering that it feels nice if they touch themselves. And we're trying to just nicely say, we just don't do that in the living room in front of the company, right? Just redirecting what's appropriate, but not shaming curiosity and things that 2, 3, 4-year-olds are having, right? Where you're not putting shame on things, but you're redirecting when certain behaviors are appropriate and how we go about appropriate behaviors. And I think for people who aren't parents, it's really helpful to be able to have those conversations with friends who are parents. I think as someone who only has a fur child and not a human child, right? Having those conversations about how my friends are teaching their kids about consent, how kids know that they don't have to hug Auntie Gabby when she comes over unless they don't want to. And I feel like that's the one that keeps getting repeated all the time when we talk about consent with kids. But I think about how important it is, of just this 3-year-old gets to decide when he's comfortable with a hug, right? Just the autonomy that teaches children. and how there's just no forcing of these behaviors that I think happened several years ago and were common as I was growing up, at least. Yeah.
But it's fascinating when you talk about the, that, yes, I mean, I think that there's this great recognition that like those, like, those, like give Auntie Gabby a hug, that these are wonderful teaching moments around consent. But they're also not just for the child, but they're so important for the other adults, because how often have we witnessed some aunt or grandma just totally bent out of shape and totally hurt because the child chooses not to hug them or give them a kiss goodbye. And so I think we also in those moments have opportunities to educate other adults in our children's lives. My brother, I think that, when it's time to leave, he's like, they'll say, Auntie Kim is leaving. Would you like to give her a hug, high five, or a wave? What would you like to do? And with the choice, I usually get a hug, but I suck it up if I get the wave. And I go, maybe next time. But not all adults do that. So I think it's also an opportunity to teach other adults about consent in those moments.
Yeah, absolutely. We do the same thing with my daughter, who's going to be 4 in a couple months. When we're going and visiting people, family, she has the choice, whether or not she wants to hug them goodbye or not. And sometimes that's happened to my parents, to where she's like, I don't want to, and they get kind of mad. And I've had discussions with my parents about, hey, it's not about her being mean or that she doesn't like you or love you. It's just, we want her to have that option to say no if she wants to say no. And, they kind of get that now, so.
I think also that's a really great opportunity for us also to educate parents. If it's the reverse, where the parent's like, oh, come on, go give Auntie Kim a hug, come on. Where like you can be like, or a wave's fine, I'm cool with that, right? Like with something that just makes it easy, but like lets the child know that like for you, like you don't have to hug me if you don't want to. And I think that's an easy way for some of us to present something different without it feeling like we're interfering with our friends' like parenting tactics, because that can feel like a whole other topic of conversation. But right, you don't want to be like, I totally disagree with how you're parenting your kids, so I'm going to tell them that they don't have to give me a hug. Like, it doesn't have to be that whole ordeal of just, it can be easy and simple. Yeah. I think we might be ready to open it up for questions from the audience. If any audience members have questions for those of us who are here tonight, or if panelists want to talk, or if audience members want to talk about things from the documentary that stuck out to them, that resonated, or something that you're taking away, you're welcome to type that in the chat box, or there's a hand raise feature in Microsoft Teams. There's a smiley face with a hand next to it, an icon, and you can raise your hand if you would like to speak your question.
Everyone must be typing.
I guess I can ask one, since that's what I've been doing anyways. I think something that stuck out to me that I appreciated was the discussion of, oh, I'll save my question. Natalie has a question. What have you noticed about how those that have been raised in a religious or abstinence-only setting, as far as how they view and feel about sex, as far as things related to guilt and shame? What are things that you've noticed about individuals that have that background or education experience?
I can speak from personal experience on this one. So I am always willing to share. I was raised and went to a private Lutheran school from pre-K through 8th grade. So when we talk about comprehensive sex education, in 7th grade, our sex education was, here is the workbook. You guys can work through this. There was not conversation had. So, and now this is also different because I also had the relationship with my parents and my mom specifically that it was an open book conversation. So on one hand, I was taught that, you know, abstinence till marriage and not having, you know, the conversations about sexuality or masturbating or any multiple partners or any LGBTQ things. And so I think that depending on where your education takes you, whether through a different high school or through a different, you know, college situation, I think my views have changed. The information that I've gained has changed. And I know that's not right. That's not, sorry, not right, but not true for everyone. You know, there are people who continue on in the religious high schools and colleges that just is how they're continue to live and grow and learn. But I think once people get to college, it definitely changes. But again, continuing the conversations, like we've said, for parents and hopefully shifting that, but then us as agencies spreading the information that's easy to reach and easy to access, as well as being accurate information. So people can look in case they start to question. But I think noting guilt and shame, I'm sure Kim or Tim could speak a lot to that with counseling and therapy.
I was going to say, like, boy, I can think of several clients over the years when, you know, that growing up with that very hardcore, very rigid religious, you know, kind of viewpoint, you know, that should they, I mean, if they're so indoctrinated that by the time they, you know, they're married, if they're a virgin on their wedding night, I got to tell you, I don't know a single one who's had a satisfying sexual experience. And oftentimes they've ended up marrying people who aren't very healthy either. And a lot of times by the time I'm seeing them, it's because they need to get out of this relationship that turned out to be very abusive. You know, so I think they're very unprepared. Very extreme. Way back when I had my internship, I remember a client whose family so refused to even talk about it that she went into her wedding night not even knowing the penis goes in vagina part of sex, didn't even know what was going to happen. So you can imagine how badly that ended up. But other things too is that, you know, you know, we're aware of a particular situation in which there is a, you know, that because that you know, if the client is lesbian, but she has anxiety and she's unable to act on that or try to masturbate to fantasies of that to explore her body without experience intense shame because her family has told her this is terrible and wrong and you shouldn't do it. You know, so she's all tied up in knots about it.
So we have another question. Sorry for the extra guest. What other resources or activities would you recommend in addition to therapy for survivors to aid in their healing journey? You know, things like exercise or time in nature or other thoughts.
I would say all of the above. Really what it comes down to, whatever the survivor really enjoys doing for self-care time is something that I would recommend doing as long as it's obviously safe. So you know, going and exercising, going for a walk down a nature trail. You know, it could be as simple as reading a book or going out and going on a long hike that takes days to go on. Really, whatever the person finds comfort, joy, peace in, that's what I would recommend that they do.
I agree with Tim. It's, you know, and some of that's about, because I think a lot of times survivors have kind of lost track of who they are too. So spending time thinking about and just kind of paying attention to what do I like, what makes me smile, what makes me laugh. Because sometimes these folks have have lost themselves, maybe especially if the assaults have happened in the context of a relationship. You know, what do you like? Whether do you like to cook? Do you like the color purple? And actually go, so playing around with those things and finding out what you like and what brings you pleasure, even if it's the little things. Like even, if you find that looking forward to watching a certain TV show makes you happy, then that's fine. And that's healing.
Yeah, I
think
kind of piggyback. Sorry, I was just kind of piggybacking off Kim. Like, yeah, whatever makes you happy. I mean, that's it's called self-care for that reason. It's whatever makes you happy and whatever makes you, find relaxation in an activity and it brings you peace, joy, all that good stuff.
And one thing I was going to add is we're all very technologically connected, clearly, but I was looking through our Instagram page today for ASTOP, and back on we're doing the 30 Days of Sam Instagram contest, as is Gabby, and I'm sure many other people, but back on day 16, we shared a supportive online community. So I think making sure that you're utilizing social media for not only like to connect with others, but also to make sure you're connecting with positive people that are going to help your growth and help your healing. So whether it's a self-care page or, maybe it's an online support group, I think that's important too. And I'm guilty of it. I know I sit and look and stare at my phone for hours at a time. So why not mix up your feed a little bit with something positive, or like actually do those self-care things when you see them pop in, whether it's on the story or in the feed, where it's like, take a deep breath, do, the square breathing or box breathing or whatever. Actually do those things. I think we all probably can benefit from that. But yes, good social media, I think, would be helpful.
I think I would also add whatever activities like make you feel safe, right, are important, and that healing is not, it's a quote by I don't even know who, but healing is not linear. It's okay if the activities that help somebody heal, sorry, she's so disruptive tonight, that help you heal, make you feel safe. Like, it's okay if those change over time. And it's okay. You are so embarrassing. It's okay if that changes over time, if one thing is helpful and then it's not a few months later. Thank you for the love. I appreciate it. So another question from Alicia is that she thought that the discussion of the distinction between the legal versus the experiential definition of sexual assault was important. Wondering if anybody maybe wants to talk about that a little more, maybe for those who haven't watched it yet, but also what your thoughts were on that, because I would agree. I thought that was really an important distinction.
I was glad she brought this up. Because I agree. I think it was I thought it was nice they brought that up. Because I when I was making notes, they also talked about the continuum of harm. That it's not as simple as sexual assault. That it exists on a continuum. I mean and I think there's that. I think the legal versus experiential definition. And I talk to clients about this a lot, you know, people who have these experiences where, you know, where they were kind of like they were coerced, where they, you know, they felt coerced, they felt, you know, like they're, you know, basically where there wasn't a no, but there absolutely was not an enthusiastic yes. And it was kind of, it's kind of somebody maybe in that fawn response of, well, I really like him and I don't want him to be mad at me and I'm going to go along. And, you know, that, well, legally that might be a tricky case, you know, that I don't know any prosecutor that would really take that on, but that doesn't mean it wasn't a sexual assault. And it doesn't mean that we can't validate that in therapy anyway, treat that like a sexual assault and validate that. And help people heal from those experiences. You know, so I think, you know, so I appreciated that they talked about that as well, because it makes me terribly sad to know how many people out there have had those experiences that are just like, yeah, that are kind of in this, that it's, you know, that's what the experience is, but it might not rise to the level that a prosecutor would take it on if you went and reported it, but that doesn't make it any less, your experience of assault any less valid. And that doesn't mean you can't go get help for it.
I would just add that our constant airing of Law and Order shows, especially SVU, which I love, but it gives the perception that the police always can and will investigate and prosecute and bring to court, and so few sexual assaults actually get to that point. So reporting to the police is not necessarily the right choice for every individual in their healing, but that seeking other help and counseling and follow-up is really important. And again, if you're a friend or a family member, that whole thing of like insisting someone go and report to the police if they don't want to, that's not what they need to do. And they need to get some other kind of help and support, because we know that that can be a traumatic experience to repeat your story over and over again and have things questioned, or it's just a little too gray in the areas of who said what and how it was done. But if your experience is that you were assaulted, then that's what you need to get the support for, even if law enforcement is not something you're feeling comfortable with, or maybe it's just many years later that you came to the realization and that sort of statute of limitations is up. So making sure that we don't believe television for law enforcement, just as we don't believe pornography for sex education and NASCAR for driver's ed.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a client not too long ago, actually, that was going through the legal process of getting their case prosecuted for, this is the client I was actually talking about with the date rape. Prosecutors actually dismissed the charges because there wasn't enough evidence. So I'm working with this individual now, and they're in a pretty good spot. But when they first started to come see me, they were pretty stuck on the idea of if this doesn't get prosecuted, then I don't know what I'm gonna do. It'll be like nothing ever it'll be like nobody believes that this happened. And this person is now at the point where they're like, you know what? It sucks. It really sucks, but I know what happened. Other people know what happened. Me as their therapist know what happened. So it's not so much the legal ramifications towards this person, but more of this isn't necessarily about the other person. This is about me moving forward and finding, refining my identity and, being a better person, even though this happened to me, and, still finding my way in life and not being totally stuck in the past with what happened.
I think as Tim brought up evidence and proof in the legal system, as the campus advocate in the group for students, I just want to make sure to articulate that the burden of proof or the level of evidence needed for a campus process is much lower than a legal process. I realize we didn't really share a lot of really encouraging things just now about survivors that report through the legal system, but I just want students to know that that process is separate if students want to go through that process on a university on campus, and that proof or evidence that is needed is much different than what would be needed in a court for a criminal process.
Mm-hmm. I think, yes, and I think this is also not to discourage anybody from if they're in a spot where like reporting is what I need to do for myself, even though there might not be a ton of evidence. And that's what all of our advocates are here for. We're here to help. So, we have, each of these agencies and organizations has advocates that can help you with that process. For some people, what they need to do to get past, what the right thing for them to do is they're just like, I'm not reporting. I don't want to deal with it. I can't go there. But some people really need to know they tried, even, because sometimes you never know. Sometimes these cases, like you can often be also surprised at the cases that a prosecutor will decide to take on. Sometimes they'll put their neck out for you, and that's pretty cool. So if you're at a spot where if this has happened to you and you're like, I know maybe it's not a really strong case, but reach out to an advocate, they'll help you. And also, and for therapy, I always tell people like you don't have to prove a thing to me.
Yeah, thank you for reiterating that. I certainly wasn't trying to discourage anyone from reporting to police or campus officials if they have been assaulted. And those types of resources also are great at getting people connected with advocates and counselors too, regardless of what's happening with any investigations or anything like that. But if you need to figure out where to get support, then those first steps can be helpful.
Absolutely. So we have a question from Kelsey. If it's possible to estimate, on average, how long do survivors stay in therapy after they initially seek it out? Or is it less based on time and more on benchmarks in the client's journey?
It varies so much. Yeah, because it's not really on time, and I think, and it's more than benchmarks. Because as I was thinking about, because I was reading this in the background, it has. I mean, that a lot of how long it takes can also have to do with how much support does this person have in their life. What are their resources? I happen to have a newer client who that some of her previous job roles actually involved her getting an awful lot of training in trauma-informed care. So she's come with a much stronger foundation of kind of like being ready than a lot of my clients do. So I anticipate that her time in therapy is actually probably going to be significantly shorter than many clients because of that. But if you've got clients who have wonderful supportive partners or families, people who are like, who get it and aren't shaming and blaming and are like, you call me in the middle of the night if you need me to, all those wonderful things. Those things will probably shorten a person's time in therapy. But on the other hand, if, we at Reach anyway, I think, Tim would probably agree with me. We sadly have a lot of clients who are very isolated, or they have families that are not supportive or healthy, or in some cases are part of the problem to begin with. These things can take longer. I've been at Reach long enough to I can think I have one client that she's been in and out of therapy with me for 10 years. She would come and she'd kind of dip in and it's only this last time in this past year that we're seeing progress. And I'm not sure, I think there were some different things that happened that made her readier, I guess. And she's, for the first time, she's coming every week instead of just coming when she's all freaked out or in crisis. She's setting small goals and she's working on them. And she's actually telling me things that have been going on for years, but she was afraid to tell me about because she was so scared to trust. So people's journeys are so different. She grew up not having anybody to trust, so it took her a very long time to trust me. And, you know, so now that she's trusting me, I can be the bridge to some of the other resources she has in her life. But that's taken 10 years before she got there.
Yeah, and I 100% agree with Kim. I've only been at Reach for about 2 years now, and I can say that I have a couple clients that I've been seeing the whole time I've been there that are survivors. But I can also say that I've had quite a few clients that I've seen in my 2 years at Reach that weren't there very long. They were there maybe 9 months to a year. You know, I mean, and these are successful discharges too. These aren't people that just came in and kind of got their feet wet and then decided, you know what, I think I'm good. But yeah, I mean, it totally depends, and I agree with Kim too that the support piece is so huge in that. The more support you have, it tends, from what I've seen, the better outcomes you're going to have. And I shouldn't say that you know, that you're going to have the best outcome ever. It's just more that the more support you have, the easier it is. Maybe not easier, but you might be able to get through it a little bit easier than somebody who doesn't have the support, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But yeah, it all depends.
Same, and there's also some strong, there's also some research that really shows that, you know, like when we're talking about kids, and so this is a great message out there to parents, that your child, that the strongest indicator of whether your child is going to kind of come out the other end of having been sexually abused in a pretty good place, is going to have good healing and recovery, is not really dependent. The most important factor is not the therapist or the therapy. The most important factor is the parent. Children whose parents are supportive, protective, child focused, those are the kids that get better. Without that, they could have the best therapists in the world, and our ability to help them be get heal is limited. So parents, you know, like, God forbid this happens to your child. My favorite story about this is, I worked with a mother, and our child therapist was working with the child, but that I think the kid they were on their way back from like a family thing. The kid was just being a pill or whatever, and mom just got mad and just said, "What is wrong with you?" And then the kid blurts it out. So and so's been touching me. And my client she did say, she's like, goodness, you know, she's like, I'm so glad nobody else was on the road because I slammed the brakes. But the first thing she did was, after she stopped the car, was to look at her child and say, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Don't you worry. I'm going to take care of this. You never have to see him again." And that kid did amazing in therapy.
I have a bit of a question I've always wondered, so I'm going to pull from the experience in this space. How does one know if they're done with therapy?
That's a really good question. You know, see, and I think I don't like.
Really good answer.
No, it's a really, really good question, and that's, you know, in terms of therapy, that's one of the reasons we do treatment plans, right? You know, we ask because it's also very individualized. And one of the things I you know, when I meet with people, because you have to create a treatment plan, and like, let's think about your goals, and they're like, what is it you want? And, you know, and I kind of, and I'll say, like, so how do you, like, picture a day when you look at me and you go, I think we're good, Kim. I think I'm good for now. I'm done. What does that look like? What's different? And I ask them to describe for me what they picture would be different. And that's our goal. And that's when they're done. You know, and I think and for some people, I think it's a bit of a process. Like some people, like, you know, and again, I've been around long enough that I've had this personally, but, you know, people, they come for therapy and then they go along, and then maybe something comes up, like maybe you have your first child, or you're getting ready to get married, or there's some a lot of times it's some milestone that happens in your life, and and clients come back because they're like, I realized I need a little tune-up. You know, so some people it's kind of an ongoing, like sometimes they dip in and out, you know, but I think, you know, it's important for a client to identify when they're done. You know, but in a more general sense, that you know, because I think I think sometimes we have to help people be realistic about what's possible, because some people just want to, like, I don't want to think about it at all. You know, and what I always tell people is I can't make it go away. I said, but one of my goals is for you is that when something comes up to remind you, that you have a moment and you go, ugh, and you know what caused it, and you take care of yourself, but it doesn't mess up your entire day, and you can move on, and it's just a blip in your day. So you can have, you have the story, and there's feelings attached, but they're not overwhelming. You know, one of my favorite stories was a client who was telling me about, you know, she was messing around with her boyfriend, and they were kind of play fighting, tickling, you know, it's kind of foreplay. And he happened to touch her in a spot, in just the wrong spot. And she had a moment. She was like, ugh. And she was safe with her partner, and she said, ooh, stop. And she's like, you know, you didn't do anything wrong. But here's what happened. And she explained it. And she said, you know, I'm not really in the mood anymore. Like, would it be okay if maybe we just watched a movie instead? And he was like, yeah, that's okay. And she said, so we just shifted gears and it was okay. That's when you're done. That's healing.
That is a great answer. It really is. I could not have said that better myself. So.
Thank you. I think that's just helpful to know, because I think for individuals who are starting therapy, right, ideally it's something that the therapist will go through, but it's really hard to know, like, what does being done with therapy look like? Because maybe I want my Thursday morning counseling appointments for the rest of my life. I don't know.
Some people do, and we have to kind of help them kind of detach.
There's those, yeah. So thank you for a great answer to that question. So we had touched a little bit on law enforcement and university when talking about proceeding, but what is the difference between the process from a law enforcement investigation to a university investigation? I'm wondering if anybody maybe has more comments on the law enforcement side. Otherwise, I can kind of chime in. I think from the starts probably look a little similar, filing a report, talking to the folks involved. So I know on our campus, it usually goes through our Dean of Students office, and they will meet with the student, usually, typically it's the victim or survivor, but in university processes, they call it the complainant, to kind of ask what happened, kind of what supports they need, offer resources, connect folks to myself, the counseling center on campus, but we also do community connections if needed. That's not something, students aren't restricted to campus resources. We have several students that are like, well, it's easier for me to go somewhere off campus, or I'm more comfortable with this. And so that's something that I consider to be part of my role of, like, connecting students with the support service that they want and they need. And so finding whoever that is for them. In a university process, they meet with witnesses, they meet with the respondent or the person who has been identified as the one who caused harm. And in a university process, the burden of proof is considered more likely than not. I was getting them confused for a second. It's considered a preponderance of evidence, or more likely than not, which is like enough to tip the scale in one direction. And they're really looking to say, is it more likely that this happened or that this didn't? And certainly with a university process, that's not something that goes on somebody's criminal record. Accountability looks much different. That can be suspension, restrictions from classes that the students share, restrictions from campus, those kinds of things, but it's not something that would show up in a legal system at all. And I would say my understanding of the legal process then is, you know, filing that report. A detective is going to kind of do the investigation, ask the questions, meet with different people to kind of see if they can meet the burden of proof that they have to meet in courts, which is beyond a reasonable doubt, which if you put that into a percentage is roughly like a 95% chance that this did happen. So they're going to be looking for the evidence and collecting that data. And then it's up to usually the district attorney's office whether or not that case moves forward and charges are filed. Yeah, if that's kind of a brief summary. I can plug an event that we have coming up on Thursday morning at 10 a.m. We have our Title IX forum with our new Title IX coordinator. So that will go into a much deeper overview of the Title IX process on campuses. So it won't touch on the law enforcement side, but if you're looking for more information on the campus piece, that would be a great event to attend. Are there any other questions that anybody has? Oh yes, thank you, Alicia. You can also set up a one-on-one meeting with myself. I can throw my emails in the chat. I am a confidential resource on our campus, so I work one-on-one with students who have experienced sexual and interpersonal violence, who want to explore options, decide if they want to report, just need to tell somebody. Alicia actually put my calendar bookings link in the chat. So you can click on that and you can choose like advocacy or prevention. And it'll just kind of link to open times on my calendar. And you can just put a meeting for yourself on my calendar and I'll show up. So that's how that works. I had one question a piece that I really liked from the documentary was about how she reclaimed her body, kind of post her experiences of sexual violence, and how the therapist in the audio clips was talking about like skydiving and tattoos and how those were both like somatic things that she was doing, where it was like, okay, there's a little bit of fear, but you're also in control. So I'm wondering if anybody wants to talk about or share ways that maybe survivors reclaim their bodies, or how someone might like decide how they might want to go about reclaiming their body, as that is likely a piece of somebody's healing journey. That was just like a piece in the documentary that really stuck out to me and I quite liked.
My one client right now that I'm working with is really into working out as part of their self-care, and they've really gotten pretty fit working out, and that was a way for them to kind of reclaim their body and to also practice self-care.
I was muted. I had a client who kind of a similar thing and I don't know that she set out in this way to kind of like reclaim her body, but she was in high school and she joined the weightlifting team of all things, and like she was this little thing, but she really got into it. And one of the things that we kind of talked about, especially as she was kind of coming towards the end of therapy, was that, you know, because there's, in order to kind of lift without injuring yourself, you have to be very mindful and aware of your body, which turned out to be very cool, a super, super very cool thing. Because the upshot of that was that, like, she was able to kind of be more in tune with her body about like when there were signals about like something doesn't seem okay, or so it got her more in touch with her body. I know some people who go and do they find somebody safe for massage. Although if you're thinking to do massage and you're a survivor, please check them out and make sure that they understand, like ask them how they proceed with massage therapy with survivors of sexual assault, because you want to make sure that they have a good understanding of trauma informed, like that they get what can happen, they get that they need to tell you what they're going to do before they do it, all those sorts of things. So make sure you check that out, but that can be really healing for some people. I've also had clients who sometimes they're just not in touch with their body at all, and I assign them to like, go get yourself some nice lotion and put lotion on every day, and notice how that feels. Do nice things. The kind of funny aside, I had a client who, she came in and apparently the lotion she picked, she had an allergic reaction to. But what I gave her credit for was once it healed, she got different lotion and she went back and she kept trying it.
I quite like that example because it's simple. And I think versus like an example in the documentary was skydiving. That's not always a simple go-to for a lot of people. That certainly would not help me to reclaim my body one bit, but lotion I can handle. So I think that's a really good point. Again, with any healing, that it looks different for everybody. Doesn't have to always be these big giant actions. It can be simple. Yeah, skydiving and tattoos are not for everybody. So we're kind of wrapping up our time together. If there are any final questions, please feel free to ask those. I know that Alicia is probably ferociously typing to drop the link to the evaluation in the chat. If you all have time to fill that out. But I just want to thank you all for being here tonight, for participating in this discussion, and a reminder that you have 2 more days to view the documentary. Also, it looks like she has done several other documentaries, which I really want to check out. So that was pretty cool, and I'm excited. But just thank you all. And the link to the evaluation is now in the chat.